Hey guys, what is up? Public back with another video, and today I want to talk about crafted gear on your Shadow Priest. There's been quite a lot of things changing on the Blizzard side. We've been kind of updating our recommendations almost daily, it feels like, based on changes. I will say, I think things are getting to a pretty stable point now. I think Blizzard is probably not going to nerf anything that's come out, just because sparks are already available to craft gear. So now this advice might change if they decide to buff up some of the underperforming things. But I wanted to make this video of like how things stand right now and my advice to you on what you should craft and when you should craft on your Shadow Priest. Let's dive in. Alright, so if you're not kind of aware of like what crafted gear is doing inside of the War Within for Season 1, crafted gear kind of lets you augment your character with pieces of gear if you're kind of missing a slot or things like that, or you want like particular stats on a piece of gear, that kind of thing. That's where it's mostly useful. Now, a change they made in Dragonflight with crafted gear, if you didn't play, is we have embellished items that you can also put on crafted gear. Now, embellished items are limited to 2 items per character, so you can only have 2 of these equipped at a time. And these give you extra effects. In our case, as a DPS, they give us extra throughput, more damage. Kind of like, think of like a trinket proc, but you can put that kind of anywhere. Now, there are kind of a limited amount of these, and they are kind of balanced differently. They each have their own kind of strengths and weaknesses, and there's kind of a wide variety to choose from. So when it comes to crafted gear in your Shadow Priest, the idea is to take advantage of those pieces of gear where it makes the most sense, because it does, do things differently. Like some people like haste better than mastery, or all kinds of different stuff. So it can be different for different specs. So in this video, I'm going to kind of go over the guidance for what that looks like from a rating perspective, and then also a Mythic Plus perspective, because there are some differences in kind of mostly how the damage patterns work out, and particularly how to, use the embellishments with the least amount of negative qualities, and you want the ones that synergize the best with the content that you're doing. Now, when it comes to the timing of your crafted gear, this is super important. Now, you can more or less do whatever you want. It seems like they're being a bit more aggressive with Sparks of Omen drops. If you're not aware, you need the Spark of Omens to actually craft a piece of gear at this higher item level. And then you can actually choose to augment this with a crest that you get from doing like Heroic Raid, Mythic Plus dungeons. They all drop these levels of crest that you can use to then increase the item level further. This will go all the way up to item level 636 with a Mythtrack crest. You need quite a lot of crest to get to that item level, which is 3 item levels below full Mythtrack gear, which Mythtrack is what the Great Vault drops for Mythic Plus items, and that's what Mythic Raid difficulty gear drops as well. So you can get just bang on really close to top end item level here. So it means earlier on you might use a bit more crafted pieces, but then at the end of the day, when you have full best in slot, you're probably only going to use just your 2 crafted pieces. So this advice is going to be kind of tailored towards more early end right now, just because we're still early on in the season. But as we go throughout the season, this advice will shift just kind of based on what we have available to us. So with this advice, I'm targeting like the couple like early weeks of the season actually launching with this advice. Now, right off the bat, I will say before I get into the rating recommendations, I would currently suggest holding off a little bit on crafting using your Spark. Now, this is by no means bad by anything. You can get this. This is kind of equivalent to like a normal crafted piece, that kind of a thing, which is pretty solid. It's a good item level. And by the time the raid comes out, you should actually have 2 Sparks available. Right now we have 1.5 Sparks in our inventory as of recording this video. You should have 2 by the time the raid comes out, and then you get every other week, you'll get actually a full Spark. So you get quite a lot of Sparks early on. Now, the reason why I say I would currently wait is because we want to optimize this and use the Spark on the best slot that we possibly can. Now, for that reason, I would personally suggest, if you're a raider or if you like to do high key Mythic Plus, after the first week of the season, you're going to get a lot of gear on a ton of slots. And I would personally wait to craft something until that kind of first initial round of gearing. That way you know what slots you're really hurting on. So for example, if you full clear Heroic Raid and you get the 2-hander from Heroic Raid, well, that means you maybe don't craft a weapon first. But if you go all that first week of gearing, you get your first vault after the first week of Season 1, and you don't get a weapon at all, well then crafting a weapon is probably a really good idea, and you'll have crest to augment that. So with that being said, that's why I kind of suggest waiting right now to use your Spark most effectively. But if you want that early boost in power, you can certainly craft it now. The risk there is that you might just end up wasting that Spark, or it might limit what gearing options that you get based on what drops. That's totally up to you, though. If you feel like you want that immediate boost in power, go ahead, follow the suggestions in the guide. But if you want to kind of wait to like use the most out of your first 2 sparks, I would suggest waiting until after that first week of season 1 more than anything, particularly after your first vault. And then you'll have a really good setup of, hey, I'm going to craft these 2 items. They're going to be in really good slots. I'm going to get a lot of really good immediate power. And by then, you should have enough crests saved up to where you can actually juice that first craft with top-end item level, maybe even 636 myth track if you get enough myth track crests. So that's kind of timing-wise what things are looking like. I'm personally probably going to wait until after we clear, the rating for our week of the first week of season 1, do some Mythic Plus over the weekend, and then after I open my vault on Tuesday, then I'll probably make the final decision on what to craft. Now, in the meantime, up until that point, if you're kind of in that holding pattern, you can still craft gear with embellishments. This is super important. As like a tailor, blacksmith, whatever else it is, you can actually craft rare pieces of gear right now in preseason that go all the way up to item level 590. So this gear does not actually cost a spark. You can see it's a little lower than what the spark item level is, but at rank 5 in the rare gear, it's 590. It's pretty good item level. It's just short of what your spark gear would be at rank 5, but it's pretty close. The reason why this is important is that 590 gear that you can craft, whether it's like a jewel crafting ring, tailoring wrists, or an inscription weapon, that kind of a thing, you can actually put these same exact embellishments on that gear. So if you're kind of waffling of like, okay, do I use my spark now? Do I wait? One of the kind of nice parts about, waiting, you can actually augment your gear with this 590 stuff and get pretty darn close to what the spark would actually give you if you're looking at holding out. Now, of course, you can do both, kind of spread out and craft even more items, but that's just the current advice. Now, to get the 590 gear, you do have to craft that rare piece with the current weathered crest that we have. So it takes 30 weathered crests per piece of 590 gear and some mats from like enchanting and things like that. But it is possible to kind of almost fill your character out with that gear. Now, the reason why that's also really crucial is because you can put embellish items on that. A lot of the embellishments that Shadow Priests want scale with secondary stats, or specifically they give you secondary stats. So whether it's haste, crit, master, whatever else it is. The secondary stat embellishments in the War Within do not scale with item level. Meaning if you craft, for example, Dark Moon Sigil Ascension, and you put that on a 590 crafted weapon, that gives you the exact same effect as if you were to craft it on a 636 weapon. So embellishments this tier, not scaling with item level, means you get that early power of embellishments even on the 590 gear, which is why I would consider waiting, because you're already getting quite a bit of that good value on your embellishments early, and you can kind of afford to wait a little bit longer before crafting to see what you get from the first week of season 1. So those are all my caveats aside. That's kind of my suggestions of when to craft things and what to do right now. But let's dive into the suggestions specifically for raiding and Mythic Plus. All right, let's dive into the crafting suggestion for raiding as a Shadow Priest here. Now, I will caveat all of what I'm about to say is things could still change. At the moment, because sparks are available, I don't expect Blizzard's going to nerf any of the suggestions that I put out here. However, it might be possible that some of the underperforming ones get buffed up, or certain bugs get fixed that make things stronger than others right now. So be sure to keep an eye on the Icy Veins guide that I'm looking at right here. That's linked in the description. Some of this advice might change. I'll try to keep on top of it. If something is drastically different, I'll pin something in the comment here. But keep that in mind, especially if this video is a couple weeks old and you're watching it. Things might have changed, and hopefully by then, if so, I've made another video. But let's dive into the raiding suggestion. So what I suggest people to do is to focus on a weapon first early. The reason for this is our best embellishment from like a rating perspective is Dark Moon Sigil Ascension. So this guy actually just gives you static secondary stats every 8 seconds that you're in combat, and it stacks up to 10 times. So, after you're in combat with for 80 seconds, you'll get full stacks of this, and it stays for the rest of combat. This is going to be our most consistent embellishment that we can use from a raiding perspective, because you're not constantly dropping combat in a raid. You just have a little bit of a ramp up early on in the fight. So it is a little less good for any fights that you're lusting on pull, but you get a lot of the most benefit out of this at the end of the fight, which is typically where you want the most consistent procs as well. If you've ever played with like Blue Silken Lining and Dragonflight or other embellishments like Lariat, and if you just didn't get a proc or you were below the health threshold, you got no value out of this. So in the last phase of like the most important part of a fight, Dark Moon Sigil Ascension will always give you full value. So we really like this embellishment for raiding specifically. Now the trick here is this can only be put on weapons So like one-handers, offhands, or the two-handed staff. This is actually a blessing and a curse here, because crafting a weapon early is really, really strong because it gives you that large boost in item level on a weapon, which gives you the most amount of intellect or main stat typically when you're upgrading something. So getting that weapon item level is a really big deal, which is why I would personally target crafting a weapon with Darkmoon Sigil Ascension first. Now, depending on the drops that you're going to get that kind of first week of the season that I mentioned, you can kind of shift this around, right? If you don't get any weapon drops week 1, I would immediately suggest crafting this on a two-handed staff if you've kind of cleared a good chunk of the raid or you've done the content that you think you're going to get through that week. This will give you the most bang for your buck in terms of like, it just costs 1 spark to get this two-hander. It's really, really strong. Now, if you end up getting like a one-handed to drop from raids, so you have like a heroic one-hander, for example, you're like, well, crafting a two-handed would kind of, just that item would just be nothing at that point. You can instead actually put this on an offhand instead, which is actually where we want to put this when it comes to our full best in slot list. You're just kind of buying your time of, when you're going to get your weapon drop. So it's up to you. If you want the kind of biggest boost early, you don't quite have a main hand weapon, I would go with the two-handed staff from Inscriptioning. If you do actually get a one-handed weapon early, particularly if it's like hero or even myth track would be perfect, because then you're in that kind of best in slot territory, then you can instead craft Darkmoon Sigil Ascension on the offhand instead. But for most people, you might not get as lucky with that with weapon wise, so getting that staff item level early is going to be really, really nice for your first craft. Then for your second craft, there's an item called the Writhing Armor Banding. Now the Writhing Armor Banding takes Ascension and just doubles it. You don't get double the amount of procs, but every time it procs, you get double the amount of secondary stat associated with it. So this is really nice because while you could craft a one-hander with Ascension and an off-hander with Ascension, because of the top-end item level that's never going to be optimal long-term, we'd rather take that item level hit from a full Myth Track 639 piece to a crafted piece 636 on like wrists or boots or something. So your second item after you already have Ascension is to put Writhing Armor Banding on a piece of armor. In this case, I would suggest doing wrists, feet, or waist are the kind of ideal slots, depending on which one is worse. You cannot put this on rings or neck, just so you know. And we don't like putting it on cloak because there is a special effect cloak in the raid. So you kind of want to leave that slot open, but cloak is also fine if you don't see yourself ever getting or wearing that. It is a very rare drop, but just something to keep in mind. So that's a good second craft for you on your Shadow Priest. And then the third one is really just to finagle around with your weapon craft, right? If you end up crafting it on a two-handed staff to start with, your third craft will then be to put Darkmoon Ascension on an offhand. You're going to want to do this eventually. The timing of this is just when you get a strong one-handed weapon. So at some point, you'll get a Myth Track one-handed weapon, either from the Great Vault from Mythic Plus or from Mythic Raid if you're able to do that. And then you can put Ascension on the offhand. You get the exact same amount of value, but it lets you get a higher main item level offhand, from your one-hander because of the 3 item level gap there. And then everything else, you can kind of just add item level if you have extra sparks and you don't have quite full Myth Track pieces. You can use craft gear to kind of replace any hero track or, lesser item level stuff that you might have. Now, I will do a couple other caveats here. You're going to see some people that might choose to use Dusk Thread Lining or Dawn Thread Lining. These are basically the new blue silken lining of this expansion, which you're not aware of what that is. It's basically when you're above 80% health now, it was 90% in Dragonflight, 80% health, you gain versatility if you have Dusk Thread, or if you're above 80% with Dawn Thread, you gain critical strike. Now, these can be really nice in some senses just because it's just a really simple embellishment. However, the health threshold can make it kind of a considerable downside on more like progression stuff when you are taking more damage. They did lower the threshold from Dragonflight, but it is still kind of, you're only going to get like 60 to 80% uptime in most things. And in hard progression content, it could be significantly less than that. So because of that reason, we get more value generally around Darkmoon Sigil Ascension. That's why I prefer to craft those. But Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, as we'll see in a second, does have a notable downside inside of Mythic Plus. So if you want something a bit more balanced, you could consider going with those instead. And we'll talk about that in the Mythic Plus section. The other caveat that I'll note is about Binding of Binding. You might have heard of this ring. It's kind of a special effect ring similar to Elemental Lariat and Dragonflight. This ring, however, gives you absolutely no benefit if you're the only one with the ring. In particular, this is giving something to someone else in your group. Usually that person has to have the ring, but there is a weird interaction with that. Where basically the gain here is if you have this ring equipped and someone else has the ring equipped, you can bind to that player and they can bind to you, and then you guys give each other the proc instead of procking for itself. This is kind of a lot of setup to make this ring actually go and do stuff. And you can't change this very often. You can only bind to someone that has the ring, and you can't change your binding without using a blasphemite. It's like an actual like gem resource to change it. Now, the proc itself is pretty competitive. It's a competitive embellishment with Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, but it is just a random proc effect, so it's not going to be as consistent as Darkmoon Sigil Ascension. So the way that it's tuned currently, because it's kind of even or within margin of error of Ascension, I don't personally suggest crafting this right now. If you're in a certain group, you don't like Ascension, or you want like kind of a hybrid setup for this and Mythic Plus, and you have like a consistent person that you can always trade the binding with, maybe it could be strong, but at current tuning, it's a lot of hassle, and I don't think it's personally worth it. But if you see people running it, that's probably why. So that is the rating suggestion for Shadow Priest. Let's dive into what changes if we're looking at Mythic Plus focused instead. All right, if you are a Mythic Plus focused gamer, this is the section for you. Now, a lot of this is going to be similar to the raid track, but you do have some options here about how you actually want to execute this. So, personally speaking, I would still strongly suggest starting off with a weapon craft, just because of how strong getting that weapon item level early is. And because of this, your strongest embellishment that you can put on a weapon is still Darkmoon Sigil Ascension. Now, there is a notable downside with Ascension in that if you drop combat for more than like I think up to 7 seconds or so, your stacks are going to start falling off with this. So the buff lasts 15 seconds, but you want to get into combat after 7 seconds to make sure it procs again to refresh the buff without falling off. So if there's a lot of downtime between packs, this thing is just going to be really choppy in value. But if you're chain pulling or doing really long pulls, you're still going to get pretty good value out of this. But early on, this is going to be tough. That being said, it's still going to be your best embellishment to put on a weapon specifically early on until you get a better myth track weapon to replace this. So I would still start off with the staff early, but again, you can kind of tailor this to what you're personally looking for. Now, after that, you want to just craft an item with Dusk Thread lining or Dawn Thread lining. Like I mentioned before, Ascension doesn't scale that well for keys, and we don't have a whole lot of really great options, so we don't want to double down on Ascension unless you are able to just constantly chain pull the whole dungeon. So then for most people, I would suggest going with Dusk Thread or Dawn Thread lining, and you can put this on most unembellished armor pieces. So you can throw this on wrists, feet, waist, like that kind of thing, similar to the writhing armor banding. Now, whether or not you choose Dusk Thread, which is verse, or Dawn Thread, which is crit, again, kind of a personal choice. I would suggest starting off with Dusk Thread lining. Verse and crit for Shadow are so close together for us that I would personally take the slight loss to run Dusk Thread, because it also gives you a little bit of a defensive benefit as well, because it's versatility. Now, this defensive benefit is like super minor. It's like 1.5% damage reduction, give or take. So if you really just want to kind of push your damage to the max, Dawn Thread running is going to technically do more damage, but again, it's within margin of error, very, very close together. And then for your third option, this is where you can then move Ascension onto an offhand if you'd like, or drop Ascension completely and just run 2 Dusk Thread or 2 Dawn Thread, or you can even mix and match if you really want to, and then have 2 of each of the lining on various pieces of armor. Now again, kind of just depends on what you want. I only start with the weapon and Ascension just to get that weapon item level early, and then eventually we'll transition it to an offhand, or again, you can choose to remove it as well. Same kind of caveats with binding and binding. You can make a stronger argument for this. However, if you're pugging keys, binding and binding is going to be a complete crapshoot, because you just don't know who's going to have it in your group, and then you might just not get any embellishment benefit at all when running this. But if you have a consistent group and you know you're going to always have a binding buddy, so to speak, this could be a good option to craft, because it will do better on average than Dawn Thread and Dusk Thread. So kind of make that personal decision for you and your group. Okay, those are my kind of early suggestions for crafting gear as a Shadow Priest, particularly with your sparks. Again, keep in mind, like I said at the top of this video, you can follow this guidance loosely for putting embellishments on your kind of 590 rare pieces that don't cost a spark. This is kind of the general plan, I would say, with your actual sparks. Now, the guide itself has a lot more detail about how these embellishments work, some of the downsides with them, and some choices that you can make here. So if you're kind of interested in how that works together, this is going to give you the full thing. I will make kind of the last caveat of, I've just made so many caveats in this video, And that's with Woven Dusk and Woven Dawn. So like I mentioned at the top of the video, I don't expect things to get nerfed, but it's possible that we could see some things get buffed, or in this case, bug fixed. So I'm going to end this talking about a kind of a lengthy bug and stuff with Woven Dusk and Woven Dawn. If you're not aware, these are the tailoring 2-set bonuses. So the Woven Dusk items gain haste when you use damaging spells. The Woven Dawn items gain mastery when you use healing spells. Now, the reason why I bring this up, and it's really weird, currently Woven Dusk is not proccing correctly, at least as a Shadow Priest. I'm not quite sure if other specs have the same problem, but if we sit there on a target dummy and just do our rotation, we only get about 5% uptime of the actual haste buff from Woven Dusk, which is horrible. This thing it does so bad, and it takes up both of our embellishment slots. I suspect that this is just a straight up bug, because if I actually just use a target dummy and just melee the target dummy, suddenly my uptime is 50%. So, which we're definitely not going to be melee priests. If this gets fixed at some point, this actually could be a really strong option, particularly for Mythic Plus. I don't think it's going to be strong enough to beat Ascension and Raid, but in Mythic Plus, this set could end up being pretty strong, but that bug just needs to get fixed. Now, the secondary set, Woven Dawn, has another bug. This says healing spells have a chance to proc mastery. Well, for whatever reason, the game thinks that our rotation is healing spells, and we get just about full uptime on this set, even though we don't press any actual healing spells. This set does actually do pretty well right now, particularly inside of Mythic Plus. I do actually sim it in the charts here. If you haven't seen the sim charts before, here's Woven Dawn right here. As you add targets, Woven Dawn still does pretty well. It's like equivalent to like Dawn Thread and Dusk Thread at like 90% uptime. But again, this is just for the 2 set here. This is just 1 Dawn Thread. So it's kind of a caveat. It's not the super best. The reason why I don't currently suggest it is because I obviously suspect this is just a straight up bug. Our damage spells are not supposed to proc something that says healing spells. So this is why I'm not suggesting you craft this right now, but it does kind of give you an indication that, okay, if they fix Dusk, we get that really good haste, which is a stat we love inside of Mythic Plus. This could end up being really strong in keys, but they have to bug fix it first. So we'll see if that happens. If it does, I will likely make a pin in the comments below, or the Icy Veins guide itself will be updated. Might do a new video in the future as well. But for now, these are the suggestions that I give for crafting items as a Shadow Priest. I know that there was so much in this video. The important thing to know is that at the end of the day, just have fun with it. A lot of this stuff is so close together. This is just my suggestions. If something looks cooler to you, or you like a play style better, just use it as a starting point, and then feel free to kind of freestyle it a little bit. These are just my suggestions. There's lots of good options here that you can take away from this. But hopefully this has kind of helped you rack your brain around what your options are and what you can do on your Shadow Priest. So thanks again, everyone that's supporting me, the patrons, the guys on YouTube, members. I appreciate everything, you guys. Even those of you guys that subbed to me on Twitch, even though I barely even stream. So thank you so much. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next video.